To this lecture on Introduction to Psychopharmacology for General Psychology. Today we're going to be talking about drugs and how drugs lead to altered states of consciousness. We'll be starting off by talking about how drugs are an artificial way in which we alter our consciousness. Sometimes we call this artificial inspiration. First, to get out some basic terms, a psychoactive drug is any chemical that influences consciousness or behavior by altering the brain's chemical messaging system. So we're talking about drugs of abuse, as well as prescription drugs for treatment for depression, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder, as well as drugs that treat anxiety and pain. Drug tolerance is an important concept to understand, which is the tendency for larger doses of a drug to be required over time to achieve the same effect. Drug tolerance occurs through a variety of biological processes. These include improved metabolic processes by which drugs are more efficiently eliminated from the body. They also include alterations in the regulation of neurotransmitter systems and receptors for neurotransmitters. So some complex mechanisms that result in an increased need for the amount of a drug to achieve the same effect. Drug withdrawal symptoms then include physical dependence and psychological dependence. There are significant differences between a physical dependence and a psychological dependence. So for drugs like opiates, there is clear physical dependence, whereas with drugs like marijuana, there tends to be only psychological dependence. As we start getting a more nuanced understanding of how drug addiction works, we've started coming up with more refined definitions. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders now describes substance use disorders rather than addiction, because not every substance use problem is an addictive problem, but it doesn't have to be an addiction in order for it to be a problem. And generally, anything that's disrupting your life or occupational or social functioning is considered to be problematic. So you can go to this website from the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration that describes in great detail alcohol use disorders, tobacco use disorders, cannabis use disorders, stimulant use disorders, hallucinogen use disorder, and opioid use disorder. So take a look at that. I think you'll find it very useful. For today, we're going to talk about some pharmacology basics, just to get a basic review of what are called pharmacokinetics, which is how the body handles drugs, pharmacodynamics, which is how drugs affect the body, and then talk about some concepts like effective dose and lethal dose. We'll start with pharmacokinetics. Pharmacokinetics refers to how a drug is handled by the body from its introduction to the body to its peak plasma concentration to its elimination. So when we talk about how a drug is handled by the body, peak plasma concentration refers to the point at which a drug is reached its peak levels within the blood. Elimination then refers to how long it takes a drug to be eliminated from the body. The efficiency of a drug's introduction depends on its route of administration. If the drug is water-soluble or lipid-soluble, it will have varying effects on how effective or how long it takes a drug to get introduced and the efficacy of different introduction routes. So, for example, a drug like marijuana tends to be very lipid-soluble, and so if it's introduced in a fatty food substance, as is often the case, it will have very different pharmacokinetic properties than it will if it's introduced in an inhalation form, as in burned cannabis. Fastest routes tend to be intravenous, intranasal, and sublingual. These tend to be water-soluble routes. Intranasal routes are very effective. Inhalation is also an important and very rapid administration route. The lungs have very large surface area, and there's lots of surface there for drugs to be absorbed. So drugs like cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine, when vaporized and inhaled, oftentimes can be administered very quickly. Slower routes are what we call the enteral routes, pills and suppositories, so those that require the GI tract, and intramuscular drugs are often more lipid-soluble and then have to be sort of absorbed through the blood system from muscles themselves. One of the important concepts to understand from pharmacokinetics is what is called elimination half-life. It's critical for understanding drug dosing, and this is simply the amount of time required for the body to eliminate half of a dose. All drugs except alcohol tend to follow some sort of elimination half-life. Alcohol actually has a linear elimination process, so it's basically 1 drink an hour, no matter how many you've had. So if you have 7 drinks, it's 7 hours before those drinks are eliminated. Now, with drugs, it's more like if you have a drug that has an 8-hour half-life, take a 100 milligram pill, 8 hours later there'll be 50 milligrams left, 8 hours after that 25, another 8 hours passes and it'll be 12 and a half. So after 24 hours, you've gone from 100 to 12 and a half milligrams, and then it will continue that way. So there are a variety of ways in which different variety of half-lives. Each drug has a different kind of half-life, and certain things can affect metabolic half-life, and it's not the same for everyone. Oftentimes it has to do with how effective your liver is, whether or not you're an efficient metabolizer or not. Some of this has to do with genetics, and also whether or not you've taken other drugs that might have depleted your stores of cytochrome P enzymes. So elimination half-life is an important thing to consider. The goal of treatment is to reach what we call steady-state plasma concentration. And so you want to be eliminating as much drug as you're taking in within sort of a window. And so you're keeping it within this window of the optimal dosing level. And so when we talk about elimination half-life, oftentimes people refer to this also as clearance time. So as a rule, it takes about 5 half-lives to reach steady-state plasma concentrations. So if a drug has a 24-hour half-life, it takes about 5 days. Many drugs have even longer half-lives, 36, 48, 72 hours, and so you multiply that times 5, and that's the point at which you'll be taking in as much as you're putting back out. Sometimes a loading dose is used to reach that steady-state concentration earlier. So in order to boost you up to that effective dosage range, they'll give you a loading dose. So a Z-Pak, for example, you take a larger dose on the first day that boosts your levels of azithromycin, and then the maintenance doses keep you in that appropriate level because it takes longer for you to eliminate. So drugs are metabolized by liver enzymes and secreted by the kidneys. In particular, drugs are metabolized by the cytochrome P450 family of enzymes. So these include things like cytochrome P2D6, cytochrome P34A. In particular, some drugs require a first-pass metabolism into other drugs. So for example, codeine, hydrocodone, and oxycodone have to be metabolized into morphine or hydromorphone. And if you have deficient levels of the cytochrome P2D6 enzyme, you won't metabolize that into morphine and won't get pain relief. On the other end of the spectrum are what we call ultrametabolizers, who actually can metabolize drugs very rapidly, and as a result they end up with a really large dose of the pain-relieving morphine and can also end up quite ill from too high of a dose. These drug metabolites that are broken down by the liver form the basis for urine testing. Some drugs have very quirky metabolic pathways. So for example, cocaine, in the presence of alcohol, will metabolize into cocaethylene, which is a more potent form of cocaine with a longer half-life. And so oftentimes those drugs are abused together. Methamphetamine is, a significant amount of methamphetamine is secreted unchanged. And as a result, urine from methamphetamine users will contain methamphetamine. I want to turn next and talk about pharmacodynamics. This relates to the effects of drugs at their target. For psychoactive drugs, we focus on the effects of a drug on neurotransmitter systems. And so we talk about how those drugs affect dopamine pathways, the reward pathway, etc. The effective dose is what is the most effective dose reported as the ED50, which is the dose at which a drug is effective for 50% of the population. Now that's, again, the point at which a dose is effective for 50%. That means a lower dose will be effective for many people and a higher dose is required for other people. So there is a great deal of variation here. There is a lot of work being done in how genetics might be able to provide us with better information about how to dose individuals. The lethal dose is the dosage that is lethal, again, reported as the LD50. It's the dose at which it is lethal for 50% of the population. And so many people, a lower dose will be lethal. For many other people, a higher dose is required for it to be lethal. So we tend to be very conservative and do things like an LD5, which is a lethal dose for 5% of the population, and try to stay below that, just to try to be conservative. And so oftentimes we talk about the effectiveness of a drug, and that's sort of the difference between the effective dose and the lethal dose. So if the effective dose and the lethal dose are too close together, then it's obviously a drug that's too dangerous to be used. So I want to briefly talk about psychoactive drugs. There are several different categories of drugs: depressants, stimulants, narcotics, hallucinogens, and marijuana. Depressants are simply those that depress the central nervous system, like alcohol and sedatives. Stimulants are drugs like cocaine, caffeine, nicotine, and amphetamines. Narcotics tend to be limited to opioids, such as heroin and oxycodone. And then hallucinogens, which are drugs that cause hallucinations like LSD, ketamine, and then finally marijuana. Now, this is, I think, taken from the intro-psych textbook I've been using, where they talk about overdose, physical dependence, and psychological dependence for various kinds of drugs. And what I want to make very clear is this is true for some people. Not everyone is going to crave a drug, not everyone is going to get sick from a drug, and lethal doses vary widely. So, can you overdose on alcohol? Certainly. Can you become physically dependent? Certainly. Does that mean you will become physically dependent? No. And that's what's really important to understand about this. There's a great deal that goes into physical dependence of drugs, primarily genetics, social support, whether or not you're under high levels of stress, executive functioning, all sorts of things go into this particular equation. And so it's not as simple as this. So depressants are substances that reduce the activity of the central nervous system. Alcohol is kind of the king of depressants. It's obviously legal. It's widely available. It's used across the globe. Alcohol's got a lot of psychological components to it. So expectancy theory is the idea that alcohol effects can be pronounced by people's expectations of how alcohol will influence them in particular situations. So how you expect to feel based on what you're doing is going to drive a lot about how you actually feel. So someone who is trying to sort of drink their pain away, it's not really an effective thing to do. Whereas people that are out to have a really good time will oftentimes end up with that expectancy driving their feelings. In alcohol studies, you have to do what's called the balanced placebo design. This is a study design in which behavior is observed following the presence or absence of an actual stimulus, and also following the presence or absence of a placebo stimulus. Alcohol has very high placebo effects, so you have to very carefully craft these kinds of studies in order to determine whether or not you're actually getting a genuine effect of alcohol. Alcohol myopia is a condition that results when alcohol hampers attention, leading people to respond in simple ways to complex situations. This is why people become belligerent, they become angry in very inappropriate ways. Other depressants include barbiturates, benzodiazepines, and toxic inhalants. Benzodiazepines and barbiturates are prescribed to treat anxiety or sleep problems. Toxic inhalants are not. It's a very poorly worded sentence I have there. Barbiturates are not used very often because they really have a significant risk for overdose. Benzodiazepines and their close relatives are used for treating anxiety and for treating sleep problems. Stimulants are substances that excite the central nervous system, heightening arousal and activity levels. These include caffeine, amphetamines, nicotine, cocaine, modafinil, and ecstasy, which is methylene-dioxymethamphetamine, which also falls into the hallucinogen category. Stimulants elicit euphoria and confidence and motivation. They increase dopamine and norepinephrine levels in the brain. Long history of cocaine use, particularly dating back to the turn of the 19th and the 20th century. Cocaine was included in Coca-Cola, which is where the Coca comes from in Coca-Cola. All of this became, of course, illegal with the Narcotic Acts. Modafinil is a newer stimulant that is used as a cognitive enhancer. We'll talk more about that later on. And ecstasy is, of course, oftentimes used as a club drug. Narcotics tend to be opiates, potentially highly addictive drugs derived from opium that relieve pain. These include heroin, morphine, oxycodone, methadone, and codeine. Drug properties are closely related to the endorphins. Their primary use is for pain relief, but they do have a great deal of use as recreational drugs. We have a huge problem in the United States right now in that people are getting addicted to these narcotics from requiring them for pain relief, and then as a result they're unable to get more drugs, so they end up turning to heroin because it's actually cheaper. Psychedelics are drugs that alter cognition and perception. These include MDMA, MDA, LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, PCP, and ketamine. The effects can be dramatic and unpredictable. There's a lot of work being done in this area, though. Particularly, ketamine is being investigated as a potential treatment for depression. In particular, one of the metabolites of ketamine seems to have pretty strong antidepressant effects. So stay tuned for more information there. Finally, marijuana, the leaves and buds of the hemp plant that produces an intoxication that is mildly hallucinogenic, which is, of course, cannabis. The active ingredient in marijuana is tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. This affects some specific receptors in the brain that can cause pain relief, and so it can be used for some medicinal purposes. It affects judgment, short-term memory, and motor skills and coordination. Its medicinal uses are controversial, but does seem to have some important uses. Questions about in the real world whether we should be regulating drugs or not. Is consciousness something that government should be able to legislate? Certainly we know the costs of drug addiction are paid by all of us. Certainly drug addiction is related to crime, though not casual use. We know that the war on drugs program was ineffective. Drugs are cheaper and are of higher quality than they were prior to the war on drugs. Cocaine is significantly cheaper and has significantly higher purity than it was in the 1980s. And right now I think a lot of people are turning to what we call a harm reduction approach. This challenges the notion that the only solution to addiction is prohibition. There are a number of places worldwide that are trying new approaches. So Portugal, for example, has started a new program where they legalized all drugs, but you can only get drugs like heroin at an injection site where you could go inject drugs with a medical professional nearby. As a result, they've reduced overdose deaths dramatically. We have a huge overdose problem in the United States. And in fact, they found that drug use actually declined after ending their prohibition on drugs. Ireland is set to try a similar approach. So we have to start thinking about better ways in which to treat rather than just an overall ban on drugs. Certainly, we are now looking at things like needle exchanges, safe injection sites as potential ways to keep people safer. And so that's an important thing to look to in the future. Final thing on altered consciousness is hypnosis. Don't want to spend much time talking about this. It's an altered state of consciousness characterized by suggestibility and the feeling that one's actions are occurring involuntarily. Essence of hypnosis is in leading people to expect that certain things will happen that are outside their conscious will. Susceptibility to hypnosis varies greatly. Not everybody can be hypnotized. It's subject to agreeableness, and people who are hypnotizable are also highly suggestible. Meditation and religious experiences. The meditation is the practice of intentional contemplation. There are a variety of techniques in use inside and outside of religion. The effects include rest, revitalization, and psychological well-being. Long-term effects are controversial, but you do see temporarily altered patterns of brain activation. Certainly mindfulness practiced meditation has been shown to improve attentional control and has potentially been shown to be effective in treating depression. Altered states may also occur during religious prayer or worship. There is certainly plenty of evidence to back up this idea. So the questions of how this comes about and its benefits are still open to interpretation, but certainly probably that kind of mindfulness prayer is probably just as good as mindfulness meditation. Again, brain activation in some of these religious experiences is similar in cases of epilepsy, where you get right anterior temporal lobe, which seems to be linked with this kind of religious ecstasies. And so you've probably seen people who have sort of this religious fit during prayer worship, and it probably looks sometimes a little bit like epilepsy, so it's not surprising. So that's our brief review of psychopharmacology and altered states